Once you have a few lights in your scene, you can speed up your workflow with the Light Explorer. This is a version of the Scene Explorer with particular settings to display only lights and their key parameters. Unfortunately, Scene Explorer does not play well with Active Shade. This applies to all of the Scene Explorer variations, such as Layer Explorer and Light Explorer. If Active Shade is running, the Scene Explorer does not update. So effectively, we can't use them both at the same time. Therefore, to see the effects of making changes in the Light Explorer, we want to set up the viewport so that it matches the production rendering as closely as possible. And we do that using the Per View presets. As we discussed earlier in the course, in the Per View settings, we just want to make sure that the rendering level is advanced, and we are illuminating with scene lights, unlimited lights. Before making any changes to our lighting, we should make sure that our viewport rendering looks something like the production rendering. So let's do an Active Shade. And we can see that the viewport rendering is pretty close. There's no ray tracing in the viewport, so we don't have any proper reflections or any diffuse bounce, so the ceiling is rendering as black. But otherwise, we're getting a fairly decent representation of the final production rendering. I'll close that Active Shade. And let's open up the Light Explorer. It's found in Tools, All Global Explorers, Light Explorer. All the lights are listed. I've got 10 rectangle lights, and these are all instances. So actually, if I make any change to one of them, it will affect all of them. If I turn light on, off for any one of them, then they'll all be disabled. But other aspects such as visibility are not instanced. So for example, I can toggle the visibility state of various lights individually, or I can turn them back on again. I can also select lights from within the Light Explorer. So I can click on one of these lights and it will highlight it in the viewport and select it so that, for example, I could go into the Modify panel and adjust some of the parameters that are not found within the Light Explorer proper, such as the Kelvin value. There is one very important parameter within the Light Explorer that we want to see. I can expand this window a little bit. Way over on the right is the light intensity in candelas. We can move these columns around. I'll click and drag that light intensity column over just to the left of the light on switch so I can get at that more easily. And I can shrink that window down again. I've got a light intensity of 10,000. 10,000 candelas is approximately 30,000 lumens. And we can see that over here in the Modify panel with one of those lights selected. Switch the intensity display over to lumens, and it's about 30,000. I want to talk a little bit more about how I arrived at this value. As I described earlier, it's a workaround to avoid using exposure control. If you're trying to reproduce some real-world lighting scenario with specific intensity values, it can get complicated. If you just plug in the physically accurate value, the render exposure will almost always be wrong, especially for interiors. The image will almost never be the correct brightness. So for example, these light fixtures are putting out about 3,000 lumens. If I set them to 3,000 lumens here in the Modify panel, then my rendering is far too dim. We see over here that the corresponding light intensity in candelas is about 950 candelas. To deal with this dim rendering, we could adjust it with exposure control. And just for reference, that's in the rendering menu, exposure control. And I could try turning it on, set it to physical camera exposure control, and turn off use physical camera controls if available. That way I can adjust all cameras with this global exposure value. And if, for example, I bring this down to a value of 5 exposure values or open it up by 1 f-stop, I'm getting a brighter image here. But exposure control also has this image control section that cannot be turned off. All we can do is try to adjust these values and attempt to bring this into a linear curve, and it's frankly not really possible. Even if I set the highlights to, let's say, 0.15 and the midtones to 0.55 and the shadows to 0, it looks like a linear curve there, but it's actually not a linear response curve. It has changed the contrast. And we can see that if, for example, I bring the exposure value down even further to 4, we're getting good contrast here, but we cannot change that contrast in post effectively because it's going to be burned in. It's a much better idea to just save out the raw image without this contrast curve burned in. So again, I don't recommend using exposure control. We could just turn it back off again and instead adjust the intensities of the lights. Now, we could take this on faith. We could plug in the real world intensity values and hope for the best. After we render, we could adjust the exposure in a post-processing program like Photoshop or After Effects. And this will probably work. As long as we render to a high dynamic range format, such as .exr, there should be no problem. But in this case, we're working blind in 3ds Max. We can't actually trust the preview in the viewport or in ActiveShade. And maybe we could try flipping exposure control on and off while we make changes, but that's very problematic for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is we're creating confusion about what we're actually rendering, and we're just wasting time turning that switch on and off. So I do recommend exposure control should be disabled, and the best solution all the way around is to multiply all of the real-world intensity values by the same amount in order to bring the image brightness into the appropriate range. And then we will have full control over the tone mapping in post-production because there's no contrast curve burned in. So for example, for this lighting fixture, I want it to output about 1,000 candelas. I'm going to set the lights to be 10 times brighter than their rated intensity. I'll go up here to the light intensity, double click on that, and type in a value of 10,000 candelas and press enter. And now we no longer have that nice contrast curve and saturation that we were seeing from the exposure control plugin, but at least now we're not stuck with whatever the exposure control gives us. We can adjust that contrast and saturation in post and not have any issues with banding or any other artifacts that might be introduced by trying to re-stretch an existing contrast curve. That's all about the Light Explorer and the rationale for not using exposure control, but rather using a multiplier for the light intensity.